I will start with prayer. O he before whose greatness everything bows. O he before whose power everything submits. O he before whose might overshadows everything. O he before whose awesomeness everything is humbled. O he before whose fearsomeness everything yields. O he before whose terribleness mountains shake. O he before whose command the heavens are raised. O he through whose permission the earths are secured. O he whose glory the thunder proclaims. O he who is never cruel to his subjects. Praise be to thee. There's no God but thee. The grandeur of all succor. Protect us from the fire, O Lord.
Please be seated. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see everybody. Nice to pretend that it's spring. We have a special guest today, and she's a very important person, first of all, because she's Sami Ahmad's mom. But I want to tell you a little bit about Mrs. Ahmad. She's a very interesting person. We're really grateful to her for coming and being with us today. She's currently an assistant vice president at Albany Medical Center, where she works with clinical teams to design and deliver electronic health record capabilities. So she's working with computers a lot and with programs and things to make healthcare better. Mrs. Ahmad was born in India, and she spent her school years in India, in Saudi Arabia, and in England. She completed her international baccalaureate at Marymount International School in London, and she has a bachelor's degree in computer science from New Mexico Tech and an MBA from the Lally School at RPI. Her past work experience includes work as a system analyst with Tata Consultancy Services in India, and the Prince Sultan Cardiac Center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Prior to joining Albany Med, she worked for Kerner Corporation of Kansas City, which is an industry leader in the area of electronic health records. And Mrs. Ahmad is also a Muslim woman who grew up in a country with a Hindu majority while studying in Catholic schools. So she's had the opportunity to understand and live her faith from a very early age. And she also has the experience of being in diverse communities such as Don Stewart, also from a very early age. And we're very grateful to you again for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Ms. Brown, and thank you very much to all of you for inviting me here today to speak about Islam. I'd just like to begin with a phrase that we as Muslims always use when we begin anything. It is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'd like you to pay attention to those two last sounds that I made, Rahman and Rahim, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. So I'll just give you, I'm standing here today, one person, one woman, representing a very, very large community of individuals today in the world. So I will try to give you a perspective from what I have learned, what I know, and how I practice my faith. I'll give you a brief history of Islam, some key points. I'll speak a little bit about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and since Mrs. Brown had expressed some interest, I'll also speak about what it means for the role of women in Islam and what it has meant for me. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how big the Muslim community is around the world, that's 1.6 billion people. About 23% of the world's population is Muslim. There are Muslims in countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, in India, pretty much throughout the world, in the Middle East, I'm sure that you've heard. The root word that Islam is derived from stands for the concept of wholeness, to be safe, and peace. But but in itself, it means voluntarily submitting to God. And the word for God that is often used in Arabic is the word Allah. It simply means God, the one God. So who is a Muslim? A Muslim is someone who recites the Shahada. And the Shahada is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. As in, there is no God but God. There is only one God, and the Prophet Muhammad was his prophet. That's the basics. That's it. That's all you have to do and believe to be a Muslim. Let me give you a little bit further details about the actions of Muslims. So there are the 5 pillars of Islam, as in the 5 main activities that Muslims undertake. The first, as I just said, is the Shahada, that you proclaim that there is only one God. The second is Salah, which basically means ritual prayer. Muslims are expected to pray 5 times during the day, at different points in the day. So just before dawn, just before sunrise, at dawn, a mid-afternoon prayer, or late afternoon prayer, an evening prayer around sunset, and then a nighttime prayer before they go to bed. They are expected to give zakat. Zakat is an obligatory donation that one is expected to give after you have a certain amount of savings. And if you hold those savings for a period of 1 year, and it's a very small amount, you're expected to pay about 2.5% of your savings. Donate that to Muslims in the community so that money is given and other people are taken care of. It's almost like Social Security if you think about it that way. The next obligation is fasting. In the month of Ramadan, and Muslims follow a lunar calendar. So instead of following the solar cycle of January, February, March, etc., there are designated months that follow the cycle of the moon as it rises and as it wanes. And in the month of Ramadan, which can happen anytime during the solar year, this year it's going to occur in June. For that month, from dawn to dusk, Muslims are expected to refrain from eating, drinking, smoking, and devote themselves to prayer, to do good deeds, and to reflect upon the bounties that the Creator has given them. That is the 4th. And the last obligation, the 5th pillar, is the pilgrimage. If they have the means, they are expected to go once in their lifetime to Mecca for pilgrimage. Now that is Islam. I'd like to talk to you about different levels of faith. There is the concept in Islam of the very basic, the minimum that you do. And we started with Shahada, saying that all you have to do is say, I witness that there is God, one God, and the Prophet Muhammad was his prophet. Then there were the activities. But there are layers of understanding of the faith, and there are 3 different layers. The basic one is Islam. Then the next level is called Iman. And Iman is more about faith in your belief. So it expands upon what Islam is. And it's also further belief in the angels, the belief in not only Prophet Muhammad as a prophet, but because Muslims believe that he is the last prophet in the Abrahamic tradition, that to believe in all the prophets that God has sent upon the earth to help guide humanity to better actions, to be a better society. So Iman is the belief in God, His angels, His books, and these prophets brought with them messages, and communities believed in them and followed them. His messengers, the day of judgment, and the fact that God will judge our actions, and there is the existence of heaven and hell. But I wanted to really tell you about the highest level, which I think you'll find interesting. It's called Ihsan. So we have the actions, then we have belief, and now there's Ihsan. And Ihsan really means to worship God, to worship your Creator, as if you see Him. And then it further clarifies, for though you can't see Him because He is the unseen, and Muslims don't have images and don't have a shape or form that they see as God, for though that you cannot see Him, He sees you. So imagine our actions. For the little ones for every one of us. What would they be like if at all times you felt that you were in front of your Creator? In front of the being that created you, that blessed you with eyes and hearing and all the wonderful things that you have on this earth. How would you behave? Just as a little example, how would you behave if you knew Mrs. Brown was watching you all the time? I think that would be a slightly different way that we would act. So, with that, let me give you some of the details and switch to the topic of Prophet Muhammad, who he was, how he brought the message, and a little bit more details about him. So, he was born in around 570 AD in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. At the time, that society was largely nomads, Bedouins. However, there were settlements, and in the city of Mecca there was the Kaaba, which was a cubicle building where there were housed some 360 or so or more gods that the communities around worshipped, and people came for pilgrimage there. So this was a trading center. So this child who was born, his name was Muhammad. His parents were from a prominent family of that city, and he was born at a time where it was a route of connectivity. So keep that in mind. Unfortunately, he lost his parents at an early age. However, since this was a tribal system, the tribe took care of him, and he was raised mostly by his uncle. Because this was a trading route, as I said, he himself became a businessman, and he was quite successful, and he worked with his uncle. Around the age of 25, he was noticed by a businesswoman. Her name was Khadija, and he did some work for her. She was very impressed by him, by his character, and she offered him marriage. She was at the time 40 years of age. He was 25. He accepted, they married, and they had a happy married life, as far as we know. Now, by this time, there's no prophethood. This is just a nice young man living in the community, very well-known, well-liked. And I'll just describe a very small incident from his life which tells us about his character. This is before prophethood. The Kaaba, as I mentioned, was this house that had idols in it, and it was very prominent. And it was being rebuilt, reconstructed, and there was a key piece, a key stone that had to be put in, and all the tribes wanted to be, the chieftains wanted to be the ones to put it back in, and they couldn't agree. So they said, well, let's ask Al-Amin, let's ask Al-Sadiq, that those were the names that were given to the Prophet Muhammad, as in the trustworthy one, the truthful one. So they went to him and they asked him, can you help us figure this out? Who should be the one to put this stone in? And what he offered was a very simple solution. He said, bring a piece of cloth. It was spread on the ground. The rock was put on that cloth, and all the chiefs held that cloth and raised it together, and the Prophet put it in place. So he was that kind of a man in the community. He started getting very concerned about some of the problems that he saw in his society. There was slavery at the time, women were very oppressed, there were all kinds of things that were going on that disturbed him. So he used to go up to a mountain nearby and reflect upon these things, and the cave that he went into was called Hira. And at about the age of 40, one day when he was in there, he all of a sudden felt a great pressure. And he got scared because he was all by himself, and he would stay up there for days at times. And he heard a voice, and it said, read, Iqra. And he didn't know how to respond. He didn't know how to read. So he said, I can't read. Then he felt the pressure again, and a squeeze almost, a physical presence around his body. And again the command, read. And he again responded, I can't read. I don't know how to read. And then finally, the first revelation came and it said, read, read in the name of God who created you. And this was the angel Gabriel. And he was so shaken by this experience that he didn't know what had happened to him and what to do about it. So he ran home, and he was shivering and shaking, and he asked his wife to cover him. And he thought, something was very, very wrong with him. So he then explained to her what had happened to him, and he felt very upset by it. And she convinced him. She said, you are a kind man. You are a wonderful man. You're a great husband and father. God will not betray you. Why don't you go? And she recommended an uncle of hers, and he went and spoke to him about this. And that individual verified that, yes, it looks like the seed of prophethood has come upon you, and you have been chosen by the Creator to deliver this message. So this is the story of how his prophethood began. And throughout his life, I don't have enough time, unfortunately, to go through many more details, but I will just tell you that he started preaching to his family and friends, and then eventually also to the community. He received a great amount of resistance because what he was preaching was, remember, one God, a kind God, a Rahman and a Rahim, the merciful, the sustainer. And these were a people who believed and who traded based on 340 gods. So it was upsetting not only the mental thought that if there is one God, then that means we're all one, and we all come from the one, so we're all equal, and that slave is equal to the owner, and that woman who you think is your property is equal to you and has rights over you. This was very disturbing to the community. And as you can imagine, he dealt with a great deal of resistance. And many of the people who accepted the faith were also those who were weak, who were the orphans, the widows, those who were oppressed. And so their oppressors became more oppressive. And so this was a very difficult time for that community, but the community grew very slowly. And in a few years, the oppression got so much. And in about 619 AD, his wife passed away as well, and so did his uncle, who was his main protector. And the community moved to Medina, and they migrated. And that is called a hijrah, and that is from when the Islamic calendar starts. And we mark that from that date. The community moved to Medina. It grew there. It found a group of people that responded, that understood, that embraced the faith. And as the prophet continued to receive revelations, that first revelation that he received in the cave, that continued throughout his lifetime. And at a certain point in time, the community grew to such an extent that they were able to have a presence in Medina. There were engagements with Mecca. There were also wars between the Meccan tribes and the Muslims. And there were treaties in order to maintain the peace. And as these revelations kept coming and people understood in that community what value Islam brought to them, things started to shift slowly. And eventually Mecca was conquered, and all the people in that area accepted Islam. So let me tell you a little bit about how Islam then grew from there. So this faith was very concerned not only about, as I said earlier, about what you believe, but also actions. And it also came to reform and to give a place and a voice to all people in the community. This was something that was missing in that area. There was very little justice. It was very, only the powerful survived. They oppressed the weak. And with the advent of Islam, a framework came into being, where you had the rule of law, the communities lived together, they followed certain rules. And so by this mechanism, as that community became bigger and stronger, it reached out from beyond Saudi Arabia, and sometimes militarily, by the conquest of other lands that were nearby, and at other times, by preaching, by holy men, by messengers going out to various communities and talking about Islam, people converted, or as Muslims say, reverted, understood the message of Islam and became Muslim. At the height of the Muslim Empire, the amount of people who were Muslim at the time stretched all the way from the edge of Spain all the way into China. And as I said, people follow the faith right now all over the world. Again, the emphasis being on one God, one humanity, equality, all races being equal. This was a message that was very attractive to a lot of people around the world. I spoke about the word Rahman and Rahim, and I asked you to remember that. And I'm going to switch to talk just very briefly about women in Islam. Because as I said, everything that we begin, we start with the words Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And the word Rahman and Rahim have the same root. The root word is Raham. And Raham means the womb. So while some people think that Islam is a religion that is very male-dominated or focused on the way that God himself, and I'm saying himself because I don't have any other word to use, perhaps itself, talks about him, is by referring to the womb. There can be no more feminine aspect than from where we are born. And that is how God continues to refer to himself. He is the merciful, the sustainer. So think about that in terms of what it means to be a woman. Because you say that all the time, and that is how your Creator refers to himself as well. Some of the quotes, and much of the history of Islam that has come down to us is the Quran, which is a compilation of all those messages that came to the Prophet, but also the history that his companions recorded, which is called the Hadith. And there are many conversations that occurred between the Prophet and his companions through the years, and those were recorded. And I'll just share with you some of the things that were said. For example, one of the common sayings that is often spoken about in Islam is that heaven lies under your mother's feet. There is an incident that occurred when a man came up to the Prophet and asked him, "Who has the greatest rights on me?" And the Prophet responded, "Your mother." So he thought, okay, who next has rights over me? And the Prophet responded, "Your mother." And then he asked again, "And who has rights over me?" He said, "Your mother." He kept trying. This was a tenacious guy. "And who else has rights over me?" He said, "Your father." So if you think about the level of emphasis that is given to the mother, it is at a degree that is much greater and far more centered than one would imagine. Some of the other things that are encoded, as I said, Islam being more a way of living and a way of organizing society, things like inheritance were codified for women, their right to their personal wealth. So for example, a husband is responsible for taking care of the family, for his wife, to clothe her, to feed her, just like he keeps himself. But the wife, when she has her own means, is not responsible to share that with her husband, and that is her personal wealth. And she has no responsibilities in that regard. So again, something to keep in mind that perhaps people are not aware of. Women are also given the rights to education, and they are also very clearly spoken about in terms of what they're responsible for and how they're responsible for in terms of their deeds. So I'll just read you a little bit of what the Quran says with regard to what is needed. Excuse me while I find my notes. There was a question raised by someone in the community that why does the Quran only address men? And there's a verse in the Quran which states, for the believing men and for the believing women, for the pious men and for the pious women. And it continues in that vein to make clear that you are judged for your actions and not by your gender. You are judged not by the color of your skin or which race you're from, by your actions. That is the most important thing. And one last thing that I would like to address before I close, because a lot of people have questions about that, is that they often ask questions with regard to the veil. And what does it mean? Because what they see, the public image of Muslim women, very often is that they feel that they are oppressed because they have to wear a certain amount of clothing or dress a certain way. Islam doesn't necessarily prescribe any kind of garment. As you can imagine, if it's a religion that came for all humanity, it can't say that somebody else's clothes are better than other people's clothes. Arabs are not better or superior than non-Arabs. No particular form is prescribed there. However, there is a particular verse that I'd like to recite to you of the translation and ask you to reflect on that. Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. That will make for greater purity for them. And Allah is well acquainted with all that they do. So again, remember that concept of the Creator in front of you. You are always in front of your Creator, so your intention is always clear to the Creator. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty. And they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof. So this is with regard to modesty. The veil comes as an implement, as an instrument to help guard your modesty. And if you think about it, the first instructions are given to men to lower their gaze, to be modest in the public space. And then the instructions are given to women, the same instructions. And then there's a little bit extra, because women were obviously using jewelry and ornaments, so therefore there's a little bit there in terms of what is needed and what should be in the public space versus what they do in private. So, I just would like to close by stating that I hope you learned something new about Islam. In my own personal journey, as Mrs. Brown stated, I was born and raised in India. I learned much about Islam from my parents, as well as my grandparents. And my grandmother was actually, had a master's degree in Arabic and in English, and was a scholar of the Quran. And other members of the family were as well. So they very much, living in India, understood and appreciated their faith and gave that appreciation to the children of the family. And I'm very fortunate, as I said, to be here with you and happy to share anything else. So thank you.
So much of what you said today, I think, is helpful for all of us as we look around us and look at our friends and think about people who may be different than we are, and to understand both the differences and the similarities. So we want to give you a tote bag.